The 1980s and 90s were a very interesting time for the Walt Disney Company. In case you don't know, Disney was not doing all that well financially by the early 80s, and was actually in real danger of being sold outright because of just how unprofitable it had become throughout the 70s. In a last-ditch effort to prevent that and save the company, they ended up bringing on Michael Eisner to serve as the new CEO. Eisner, with his background in the film industry from previously working as the president of Paramount Pictures, would then use movies and films to put Disney back in the green. And this led to many of the classic live-action and animated Disney films that came out of that time period. However, with this video, I really want to focus in on one particular movie from the early 2000s, that being 2003's Haunted Mansion. In this video, we'll be talking about the history of the movie itself, as well as how many of the concepts and ideas were changed throughout its production, and how the final product stacks up against the earlier versions. So, with that being said, let's take a quick little detour through our normal Spooktober and check out the movie. Don't worry guys, it'll only be 20 minutes tops.
No more than 20 minutes, 20 minutes tops.
While the movie was released in 2003, the idea for a film based on the classic Disney ride can be traced all the way back to the early 1990s. Given the aforementioned boom when it came to Disney's almost mass production of movies throughout the 80s, they began looking anywhere they could for subject matter. And it wasn't long before they started looking inwards and realized they could base movies off of Disney attractions. Not long after that, screenwriters Jim Hill and Sheila Greenberg put together a script for a movie based on the Haunted Mansion. The script was largely influenced by the original unused storyline for the attraction, involving the sea captain, a character almost completely absent from the final ride. Disney then optioned the script and considered what all they could do with it, planning on either turning it into a film or a role-playing video game. However, when Disney's Hocus Pocus came out and bombed that same year, they lost pretty much all interest in any kind of horror comedy projects, effectively rendering the movie dead in the water. Fast forward 4 years later to 1997, and Disney releases a made-for-TV movie based on the Tower of Terror. With the movie's moderate success, Disney once again got into contact with Hill and Greenberg, hoping to now turn their script into an episode of The Wonderful World of Disney, just like the Tower of Terror. After that, they also brought on Keystone Entertainment to work production on the project before canceling it again, likely due to the fact that the movie would have just cost too much for a single episode of a TV show. It wasn't until the early 2000s that Disney decided to try their hand again at turning the mansion into a movie. This was part of their big push from around that time to create more ride-based films. Development on the new version of the Haunted Mansion began sometime in 2001, and was completely unrelated to any of the earlier versions of the film, this time with David Berenbaum writing and Rob Minkoff directing. By the time Disney went public with the movie and officially announced it in 2002, they had also confirmed that people like Eddie Murphy and Jennifer Tilly would be starring in it, already raising some suspicions that the movie wouldn't be staying as true to the attraction as some fans had hoped. Eventually, The Haunted Mansion was released on November 26th of 2003. Meeting a lukewarm reaction from audiences, many viewers, especially die-hard fans of the attraction, outright hated the movie for its lack of connection to the original ride. Many critics and reviewers stated that the film just wasn't scary or funny enough to warrant any kind of real reaction, resulting in a pretty run-of-the-mill family comedy set to the tone of an old Disney dark ride. But despite its negative reception, the movie went on to gross over $182 million against its $90 million budget, technically classifying it as a success. Alright, now that we know the backstory behind the movie itself, I think we ought to take a closer look at its actual story. Now, in the off chance that you haven't seen the movie, or it's been a while since you have, I'd strongly recommend checking it out before watching the rest of this video. Especially now, with the Halloween season in full effect, this movie, despite all its flaws, still gets the official Spooktober seal of approval, so do yourself that favor and check it out. But if you choose to be stubborn and not take good advice when it's given, let me just sum up the plot real quick. Real estate extraordinaire Jim Evers ends up getting into hot water with his wife over missing their wedding anniversary on account of his workaholic tendencies. In an attempt to mend the relationship, Jim suggests a family trip to the lake, but ends up getting sidetracked when asked to look at a property that's for sale on the way up there. After entering the Gracie Manor, a house that, unbeknownst to them, is actually haunted, Jim and his family find themselves embroiled in a plot going back centuries between the master, his butler, and his late fiancée. As far as the movie goes, the story was relatively solid and entertaining. Good performances from some of the more serious actors also gave it a big boost. In terms of production, there were really quite a few talented people involved in everything from set design to costuming and special effects. When stripped away of its bad parts, the movie is actually quite serious, including themes like broken relationships, suicide, and even murder. The only problem is that the movie still has all those bad parts. For every one great scene between characters with some depth and emotion, you get 3 with Eddie Murphy and Madame Leota cracking jokes.
All you said I had to do was find this key. I got the key, and now you're telling me the story about a trunk. The key is the answer to all, remember?
Look, I don't make the rules, okay? I just work here.
Okay, that's it. That's the last straw. I had enough of this nonsense.
And this takes me back to what some of the critics said earlier. Without the Haunted Mansion tie-in, the movie would have very likely been quickly forgotten for its failure to commit on either of its 2 conflicting themes, seriousness and humor. Couple that with its overdependence on blatantly referencing the attraction instead of creating a story around it, and you've got a real mess of a movie. But the real question here is, what happened? What got lost in translation from the original attraction storyline to the one we see in the movie? And how could the writer so obviously miss the entire point of the ride, ignoring everything that made it entertaining? Well, after reading some of the various script leaks that came out leading up to the movie's release, it becomes very obvious that the movie we got was almost completely different from what it was supposed to be, even just 1 year earlier. In March of 2003, Jim Hill, that's right, the same Jim Hill who co-wrote the first Haunted Mansion movie, put out an article titled "What Was the Original Screenplay for the Haunted Mansion Movie Like?" Instead of going in detail about his version of the script, the article instead explains that a reader on his site had access to an early version of the screenplay from January of 2002. He then goes on to give many details about what that version of the movie included. For the most part, the author of the article praises the movie's writer, David Berenbaum, for the amount of research put into the story, and how it, quote, built on real pieces of the ride's mythology. Of course, if you've seen the actual movie, you'll know that that wasn't the case for the final version, as over the course of the next year, the script would be drastically changed, resulting in an almost completely different film. So let's go through the early version's plot and see what all was changed. The setup for the original is surprisingly like what the final version entailed, including the death of Master Gracie's bride and him taking his own life as the result. Similarly, the character of Jim Evers is also very much like what Eddie Murphy portrayed, the only difference there being that originally he was more focused on getting ahead in the real estate business, as opposed to just being a workaholic like in the later version. Also, the setup for getting the family into the mansion itself was changed too. Instead of making a last-minute change of plans while going on vacation, the original script had Jim going to the Gracie Manor to receive a promotion from his boss. In order to make a better impression, he also drags along his family, since his boss is very fond of the idea of family. This then kicks off a series of events where the Evers family is separated, eventually resulting in Jim meeting Leota, who tells him that unless they can free the dead bride and lift the curse by the 13th hour, they'll be trapped inside the house permanently, doomed to join its ghostly residents. The rest of the original story very much follows the final version, with some slight changes like replacing the supporting characters of Ezra and Emma with other characters from the attraction, like the caretaker and hitchhiking ghosts, all of which made a quick cameo in the final movie but didn't play any real part in the story. From what the author describes in the Jim Hill article, it seems like the movie had a mostly serious tone, and matched the atmosphere, mood, and theme of the attraction quite nicely. For whatever reason, it seems like the studio lost faith in the original screenplay, prompting them to add jokes and humor just about everywhere, seriously undermining the darker tone of the film.
Please accept this waterproof calendar as a token of our appreciation.
Very well.
But to better sum up these points, let me throw it over to my buddy Mark from Yesterworld, who can do a much better job explaining why the movie was so terrible.
So let's get this out of the way first. The Haunted Mansion, in my personal opinion, is not a good movie. Not even close. But rather than make a bunch of jokes or tear the movie apart, let's talk about why it failed to connect with audiences and critics on so many levels. But to do that, let's compare it to another attraction-based movie released the very same year but to critical success. Pirates of the Caribbean: The Curse of the Black Pearl. Hear me out. Pirates of the Caribbean had a creative plot with a pretty solid narrative overall that stood on its own from the attraction it was based on. The movie does have a lot of throwbacks to the ride, but they're often seamlessly blended into the story and world the filmmakers created. The Haunted Mansion has a decent plot but incredibly weak narrative that puts more of a priority on references to the ride than immersing you into the story and its world.
Well, There's always, my way.
Johnny Depp absolutely stole Curse of the Black Pearl as Captain Jack Sparrow, with a fascinating character that blended seamlessly into the film's narrative and, again, its world. But with The Haunted Mansion, they chose to cast comedian superstar Eddie Murphy. Eddie Murphy doesn't play the character of Jim Evers, he plays the character of Eddie Murphy that we've seen a million times already. He has a few moments, but with all the awkward and painfully unfunny monologues and jokes, it's obvious he was given far too much leverage with the dialogue. In the end, it's just plain uninteresting to watch and makes for an awful protagonist for this type of movie. Put simply, the movie chose to focus on the comedy talents of Eddie Murphy and shoehorned Haunted Mansion references, as opposed to, telling a compelling story with memorable characters. On the other hand, Pirates of the Caribbean used the ride as a foundation and utilized the actors' talents to deliver a satisfying cinematic experience, and unlike Haunted Mansion, doesn't rely on the audience already being a fan of the attraction. I'd love to see the Haunted Mansion given another chance because I truly believe if done right, it could be a fantastic movie.
After what we ended up with, it's surprising that Disney would even want to try another movie based on the Haunted Mansion. But back in 2010, they announced that they were developing a new movie based on the attraction, this time with Guillermo del Toro writing and producing it. The story is said to be centered around the Hatbox Ghost, likely brought on by the character's recent resurgence in popularity. The final draft was submitted to Disney in 2012 and is currently just waiting to be made. As of now, it's yet to be seen whether or not Disney will choose to go forward with the concept, but I do think them taking another stab at the movie would be quite interesting to see. When it's all said and done, the Haunted Mansion did prove to be quite the disappointment when it came out. However, that's not to say there aren't a few good aspects throughout it. While the humor might have fallen on its face most of the time, some scenes, like the mausoleum, really came across as genuinely scary. A very welcoming surprise in a movie that, for the most part, resembles the film version of a saltine cracker. I do also want to give a lot of credit to the people who worked on it. While the end result wasn't all that great, you can tell they put a lot of effort into everything, from the look of the scenes to just how the movie was shot. Even the visual effects they used on Leota and the Ghost were pretty impressive for the time, and like I said before, a few really great performances managed to carry the rest of the film. As much as I objectively hate The Haunted Mansion as a movie, I have to say it's still one of my favorite to watch whenever Halloween rolls around. Something about the over-the-top and extremely hokey performance from Eddie Murphy manages to give the movie its own distinct charm that, if looked at properly, can be quite enjoyable. But I think we can all agree it's good the movie didn't succeed critically, otherwise we might be writing a very different Haunted Mansion today. But I still do wish the movie could have been great, or at the very least as good as it was supposed to be originally.
Do the Broncos have a shot this year? Hello?
Serpents and spiders.
Hello?
Tail